Welcome to Sinister Secrets, where the line between the living and the dead fades into the shadows. Tonight we venture into the haunting world of the grave digger's cabin, a place where history, legend and terror intertwine. On the surface, it's just a decrepit shack, tucked away in an overgrown cemetery. But beneath its rotting wooden floors and crumbling walls lies a story that will send shivers down your spine. This cabin was once home to Ezekiel Craven, a reclusive gravedigger with an unsettling obsession. Locals whispered of strange lights flickering through the cabin windows at night, and chants that seemed to call to something or someone from beyond. And then one day Ezekiel vanished, leaving behind nothing but fear and unanswered questions. Over the years, those brave or foolish enough to step inside the cabin have reported chilling encounters. Some claim to have found hidden trapdoors leading to dark secrets buried beneath the cabin. Others speak of a monstrous creature that roams the cemetery, burrowing through the earth and dragging its victims into the void. Paranormal investigators have captured eerie whispers and witnessed claw marks appearing on the walls, as if unseen forces are desperate to escape or to pull you in. This isn't just the story of a haunted cabin, it's a tale of dark rituals, cursed artifacts, and a monstrous presence that still lingers. It's a journey into the unknown, a place where reality is stranger and more terrifying than fiction. If you're ready to confront the horrors of the gravedigger's cabin, let's begin. On the outskirts of a small forgotten town nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia, a cemetery stretched across a desolate hill known to locals as Black Hollow Ridge. The cemetery, long abandoned by all but nature, was hidden behind a thick grove of gnarled oak and hemlock trees, their roots twisting through the earth like skeletal fingers. A narrow dirt road, overgrown with moss and weeds, wound its way up the ridge, leading to the cemetery's rusted iron gates, which creaked ominously in the wind. At the very edge of this graveyard, perched precariously near a steep drop into the ravine below, stood the infamous gravedigger's cabin. The cabin, small and unassuming at first glance, seemed to absorb the shadows around it. Its weathered wood was darkened by decades of rain, its windows coated with grime that reflected the faint, pale moonlight like dead eyes. Built in the late 19th century, the structure had been intended as a modest shelter for the cemetery's caretaker, a solitary figure tasked with tending to the graves scattered across the hill. From dawn to dusk, the caretaker would dig graves, clear the creeping ivy from headstones, and prepare the dead for their final rest. By night, the cabin became his sanctuary, a lonely refuge surrounded by the restless silence of the dead and the faint, mournful whispers carried on the wind. Positioned just steps away from the oldest graves, the cabin seemed less like a place for the living and more like a guardian of the forgotten souls buried in Black Hollow Ridge. But the first man to inhabit this cabin, Ezekiel Craven, was no ordinary gravedigger. Ezekiel arrived in the town under mysterious circumstances, carrying little more than a small trunk and an aura of unease. He was a tall, gaunt figure with piercing eyes that seemed to look straight through you. The townsfolk whispered about his past, but never dared to ask him directly. What little they knew of him only deepened their suspicions. He rarely ventured beyond the cemetery and spoke even less. His only companions were the rows of headstones and the occasional mourners who passed through to bury their loved ones. The cabin itself was simple but practical, a single room with a small cot, a rickety wooden table, and a fireplace that seemed to groan with each gust of wind. But as the years passed, the locals began to notice strange occurrences around Ezekiel and his solitary home. At night, faint flickers of light could be seen through the cabin's windows, even though no visitors were ever seen entering. The glow wasn't the warm orange of a fire, but a sickly green hue that seemed unnatural. Passers-by often claimed they heard chants, low, guttural whispers that carried on the wind, growing louder the closer they came to the cemetery. The stories grew darker with each telling. Ezekiel, they said, was no ordinary gravedigger. He was obsessed with the occult. His fascination with death extended beyond the bodies he buried. Some claimed to have seen him at the foot of freshly dug graves, mumbling in a language no one could understand. Others swore they saw him collecting animal bones and arranging them in strange patterns around the cemetery. Ezekiel's cabin, once seen as a place of solitude, was now rumored to be a sanctuary for forbidden rituals. Despite the growing unease, Ezekiel remained employed. He was meticulous in his work, keeping the cemetery pristine and ensuring the dead were buried with care. The town couldn't afford to lose such a reliable caretaker, even if he was an outcast. But the whispers never stopped, and neither did the strange happenings. Then one fateful autumn the disappearances began. It started with small things, pets vanishing from the edges of town. Then it escalated. A young boy, no older than 10, went missing after wandering too close to the cemetery. A traveller passing through the town was last seen heading toward the graveyard, never to be found again. The townsfolk grew restless, their fears pointing squarely at Ezekiel Craven. But when confronted, he remained eerily calm, denying any involvement and insisting he was merely a caretaker of the dead. And then, one night, Ezekiel vanished. The lantern in his cabin window went dark, and the cemetery fell silent. When the townsfolk finally mustered the courage to investigate, they found the cabin abandoned. Inside, they discovered strange markings carved into the walls and floors, symbols they couldn't decipher. A book, bound in cracked leather and filled with incomprehensible writings, sat on the table. The fireplace was cold, but beneath the ashes, they found charred bones, too large to belong to any animal. Ezekiel was never seen again, but his disappearance only deepened the cabin's dark reputation. Over time, the cemetery became a place of dread, avoided even during the day. The cabin stood as a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded, its rotting walls absorbing the whispers of the dead and the fears of the living. And while the townsfolk tried to move on, they could never shake the feeling that Ezekiel's rituals had awakened something that still lingered in the cemetery, watching, waiting, and hungry for the living. It was the autumn of 1893 when Ezekiel Craven vanished without a trace. The last time anyone saw him, he was pacing among the graves at dusk, muttering under his breath. Some say the setting sun cast an eerie glow on his gaunt face, making him look less like a man and more like a shadow of something otherworldly. That night, a storm rolled in, the kind that seemed to tear at the earth itself. Thunder boomed so loudly it shook windows in the nearby town, and lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the graveyard in brief, ghostly flashes. By morning, Ezekiel was gone. The townsfolk were divided on what had happened to him. Some believed the spirits he had disturbed had finally exacted their revenge, dragging him into the afterlife as payment for his meddling. Others whispered of a ritual, a final desperate attempt by Ezekiel to summon a power far greater than he could control. They said the ritual had backfired, consuming him entirely and leaving nothing but scorched ground where he once stood. Yet when the braver townsfolk ventured to the cemetery to look for him, there was no sign of Ezekiel. No footprints, no burned grass, no remnants of his belongings. His cabin stood eerily quiet, as though it had never been inhabited at all. But his disappearance was only the beginning. Within days, the cemetery became a place of unease. Freshly dug graves were found disturbed, their coffins empty, as if the bodies had simply vanished into thin air. Some said they saw deep, unnatural claw marks along the edges of the graves, as though something had crawled out from below. Others claimed to hear faint scratching noises beneath their feet, as if something was tunneling through the earth. Then there were the shadowy figures. Visitors reported seeing dark silhouettes moving between the gravestones at night, their forms unnaturally tall and thin. These shadows didn't walk like people. They glided, silent and fluid, vanishing the moment anyone dared to approach. A few unlucky souls claimed the figures had followed them, their icy presence lingering long after they had fled the graveyard. The most horrifying accounts came from those who heard the wails. These weren't the cries of the wind or the howls of distant animals. They were human, or almost human, high-pitched, mournful, and filled with a kind of anguish that made the hairs on the back of one's neck stand on end. The sound would echo through the graveyard at unpredictable times, cutting through the silence like a blade. Those who heard it said it stayed with them for days, echoing in their dreams and pulling them back to the cemetery, as if the wail itself were calling them. The cabin, now abandoned, took on a sinister reputation. The once simple wooden shack seemed to transform overnight. Its windows, coated in grime, reflected strange, shifting lights from within. The air around it grew colder, even in the heat of summer. Locals swore they saw shadows moving inside, as though someone or something was pacing the cabin's single room. Those brave enough to approach said they felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if unseen eyes were watching their every move. Yet, the cabin's sinister allure proved irresistible to thrill seekers and skeptics alike. Groups of curious teenagers dared each other to enter, only to return pale and shaken, unwilling to speak of what they had experienced. Paranormal investigators claimed their equipment malfunctioned the moment they crossed the cabin's threshold. One man even reported finding strange symbols carved into the floorboards, symbols he swore hadn't been there minutes earlier. The longer he stayed inside, the more oppressive the atmosphere became until he fled, choking on the thick, acrid smell of burning wood that had no apparent source. As the years passed, Ezekiel's name became synonymous with the strange and the unexplainable. Some believed he had succeeded in his dark rituals, transcending into another plane of existence, and that the cabin served as a gateway between worlds. Others were convinced his restless spirit still lingered, bound to the place where he had committed his unspeakable acts. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Ezekiel's disappearance marked the start of the cabin's terrifying legacy. The graveyard and its shack became a place to be avoided, a cursed ground where the living dared not tread. Yet for those who did, the experience was unforgettable, and not in ways they would ever wish to remember. As the years turned into decades, the reputation of the gravedigger's cabin only grew darker. By the mid-20th century, it was no longer just a decrepit structure at the edge of the cemetery. It was a legend, a place where whispered tales of hauntings and terror were passed down from generation to generation. Each new story seemed more terrifying than the last, blending fact and fiction until it was impossible to tell where the truth ended and the myths began. One of the most infamous tales involved a group of teenagers in the 1970s. Like many before them, they were drawn to the cabin by a dare, a test of courage fueled by youthful arrogance and the thrill of the unknown. Armed with flashlights and nervous laughter, they ventured into the cabin late one moonless night. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an old, abandoned shack. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and damp wood, and the silence was broken only by the distant rustling of leaves outside. But, as they explored further, one of them stumbled upon a loose floorboard. Beneath it, they discovered a hidden trapdoor, its edges lined with rusted iron hinges. Curiosity got the better of them, and they pried it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that seemed to descend into the earth itself. Against their better judgment, they climbed down, their flashlights illuminating walls covered in strange carved symbols. At the bottom, they found an underground chamber littered with what they swore were human bones. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly in the dim light, and the air grew colder with each passing second. Suddenly, a low guttural growl echoed through the chamber, freezing them in place. One by one, they felt icy, unseen hands grip their ankles, pulling them toward the darkness. Panicked, they scrambled back up the staircase, slamming the trapdoor shut and fleeing into the night. When they told their story, they swore they heard the sound of something clawing at the trapdoor as they ran, desperate to escape the cabin's malevolent grip. Another chilling account came from Clara Morrow, a seasoned paranormal investigator who visited the cabin in 1987. Unlike the teenagers, Clara came prepared with a tape recorder, a camera, and a firm belief in documenting the unexplained. Determined to spend the night in the cabin, she set up her equipment and waited, her nerves steeled against the eerie atmosphere. At first, there was nothing but silence, but as the night deepened, Clara began to hear faint whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her camera captured fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures darting just beyond the range of her flashlight. Then, as she sat in the corner of the cabin, she noticed something even more disturbing. Claw marks appearing on the walls before her very eyes, as though an invisible force were carving them into the wood. Clara fled the cabin at dawn, but the evidence she collected was undeniable. Her footage and recordings made headlines, shocking even the most skeptical viewers. The faint whispers, the shifting shadows, and the claw marks solidified the cabin's reputation as one of the most haunted locations in the region. Today, the gravedigger's cabin stands as a relic of terror, its dark history and paranormal activity continuing to draw those brave or foolish enough to seek answers. But for every tale of survival, there are whispers of those who entered and were never seen again. The question remains, is it curiosity or madness that compels people to venture into the unknown? Perhaps some mysteries are better left undisturbed. Among the countless tales surrounding the gravedigger's cabin, none are as horrifying or as persistently retold as the legend of the gravedigger creature. Unlike whispers of ghosts and shadows, this legend suggests something far more physical, something alive, or perhaps something that should never have been. Locals believe that Ezekiel Craven's dark rituals went beyond simple summoning or communication with spirits. They insist that one of his rituals tore open a rift between worlds and unleashed a monstrous entity bound to the cemetery. Forever tied to the land Ezekiel desecrated, this creature, often referred to as the grave digger creature, is described as a massive worm-like being with slimy, pale flesh, rows of jagged teeth, and eyes that gleam faintly like dying embers in the dark. It tunnels beneath the cemetery, disturbing graves and leaving behind collapsing earth and gaping holes where coffins should lie. What makes the creature so terrifying isn't just its appearance, but the way it hunts. It moves silently beneath the ground, the only warning of its presence being a faint rumble or the sudden hollow sound of collapsing soil. Some say it doesn't merely kill, it drags its victims beneath the earth, leaving no trace behind, as if devouring them whole. The most infamous encounter with the gravedigger creature occurred in the summer of 1996, when a group of urban explorers decided to investigate the cemetery and the cabin under the cover of darkness. They were thrill seekers, armed with flashlights, cameras, and a hunger for a good scare. The group consisted of 5 friends, each daring the others to go further into the cemetery's depths. At first, their exploration was uneventful, albeit unnerving. The group laughed nervously as they passed rows of old, crumbling headstones, the air around them thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. They reached the cabin and found it as described in countless tales, decrepit, lifeless, and almost daring them to step inside. But as they circled the structure, something shifted. One of the explorers felt it first, a faint tremor beneath their feet. At first, they dismissed it as their imagination. But then the ground shook more violently, a low, guttural sound rumbling from beneath the earth. Panic spread through the group as they realized this wasn't the result of faulty footing or shifting ground. Before they could flee, the soil beneath them burst open with a deafening roar. From the ground erupted a massive, slimy form, its gaping maw filled with rows of jagged, blood-stained teeth. Its eyeless face turned toward the group as if sensing their fear, and within seconds it attacked. One by one, the explorers were dragged into the collapsing ground, their screams swallowed by the night. Only one member of the group, a young man named Carter, managed to escape. He sprinted from the cemetery, covered in dirt and shaking uncontrollably. When he reached town, his story was dismissed by many as hysteria. But those who saw him knew he had encountered something real, something unspeakable. Carter left town shortly after, and his account became the definitive tale of the gravedigger creature. To this day, the gravedigger's cabin remains a symbol of everything dark and unknowable about the cemetery. The land around it seems cursed, marked by decades of strange occurrences, unexplained disappearances, and the lingering fear of the grave digger creature. Few dare to venture there, and those who do often leave with stories of strange sounds, trembling ground, or the unmistakable feeling of being watched. The cabin itself has fallen further into decay, its walls warped and brittle, as if the weight of its secrets is too much to bear. Yet it remains a magnet for those drawn to the unknown. Paranormal enthusiasts, thrill seekers, and the morbidly curious still find themselves pulled toward its dark allure, even as warnings from locals grow louder with each passing year. The gravedigger's cabin isn't just a place. It's a gateway into something far darker than most of us are willing to confront. It's a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Ezekiel Craven's legacy, whether born of madness or ambition, has left an indelible mark on the cemetery and all who dare to step foot there. So what do you believe? Is the gravedigger creature real, or is it just another terrifying tale born from the human imagination? And would you dare to visit the cabin for yourself, knowing what you know now? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the unknown. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Sinister Secrets for more chilling tales of the macabre. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, some secrets are better left buried. Better.